You've seen the title. You know what we're gonna be talking about today. ULTRAKILL and status effects are not something you often hear in the same sentence. If I had to guess, it's because they really only play a minor role in the game. Most of them you've probably never even noticed. I'm going to go over the status effect mentioned by the official wiki, and keep in mind, most of the information is going to be taken from there, being simplified and made easier to understand, with some additional visuals, clarifications, and facts. And now that we've cleared it up, let's start talking about the actual effects. Burning enemies take 0.2 damage per tick by default. Ticks have a delay of 0.5 seconds between them, with the first fire tick being applied instantly. In addition, burning enemies receive 1.5 times more damage. The damage multiplier is only applied to flammable enemies by default. We'll get to the rocket launcher later. Enemies can be ignited by some specific weapons, as well as most explosions. The duration of ticks is either set by the attack, or, in case of explosions, is calculated with this function, which means that the duration of the on-fire status effect is the explosion damage rounded down, multiplied by 2 plus 1. The status effect is only reapplied if the enemy stops burning, or if the new duration of the effect is greater than the remaining duration. Now let's go over the sources of the debuff. Overheated nails and saw blades ignite enemies for 8 ticks. Skull hits for 16 ticks. Golden sand for 16 ticks. Virtue beams for 40 ticks. Explosions are more complicated. Since the number of ticks depends on the damage, I won't go over every explosion in the game. Instead, I'll give you some examples. But before I do that, I need you to understand explosion damage fall-off. Let's say I have charged back this Maurice, and now the shot reflected into some of the enemies. The explosion of the reflected shot deals 6.5 damage. However, some of the enemies further away only receive 4.3 damage. Why does that happen? A lot of the explosions in the game have damage fall-off, where the damage of the explosion gets reduced after expanding past half of its maximum radius. To calculate the fall-off damage, you can use this function. Let's check if it works correctly. As I said, the Maurice explosion dealt 6.5 damage. 6.5 times 10 equals 65. Then, divided by 1.5 and rounded down, it will become 43. And then, finally, multiplied by 0.1, it becomes 4.3, which is the damage that the enemy received. Notably, the base damage of a malicious phase beam explosion is 5. However, since I have charge backed it, the coins also add to the damage. The coin damage depends on the type of beam reflected, and that's a whole new topic which I won't touch in this video. Generally, for explosive beams, all coins after the first one only add half of the damage of the first coin. In this example, the first coin adds 1 damage, and the second one adds 0.5, totaling a 6.5 damage explosion. Note that Knuckle Blaster explosions and malicious rail cannon explosions do not have damage fall-off. Why did I explain all this? Simple. It is because the number of on-fire ticks is influenced by damage fall-off. So the enemies we mentioned previously would take 25 ticks and 17 ticks of fire damage respectively. Okay, now that we've talked about the duration of the status effect, let's discuss what it actually does. I already mentioned how it increases the damage dealt to the flammable enemies by 1.5, though I have not mentioned what those enemies are. Enemies that can be set on fire include Filth, Strays, Schisms, Soldiers, Sisyphean Insurrectionists, and Mirror Reapers. However, despite being flammable, some of them are more resistant than others. Sisyphean Insurrectionists take 2 times more fire tick damage. so fire deals 0.8 damage per second to them. They are also the only enemy that cannot be killed by the effect. Steels take only half of fire tick damage, and Mirror Reapers take only a third. Keep in mind that I am talking about fire tick damage here. The damage increase is applied to all of them equally. Now let's address the elephant in the room. The Firestarter oil enables the player to set any enemy ablaze. However, enemies that are normally not susceptible to the effect do not take 1.5 times more damage when on fire. On the positive side, fire ticks for enemies covered in gasoline deal 0.5 damage instead of 0.2. Fire tick multipliers apply normally here, so an insurrectionist covered in gasoline will take 1 damage from every fire tick, which is pretty insane. The duration of the effect is now influenced by the amount of gasoline. Each fuel droplet adds 0.1 gasoline to the enemy, with a maximum of 5 gasoline. Each burning tick consumes 0.175 gasoline, so it should take 29 ticks of fire damage for the gasoline to completely burn out. After an enemy has been extinguished, the fire particles on it still linger for some time. During this period, if an enemy is covered in gasoline once more, it will continue burning without the need of igniting it again. Phew, that should be enough about the on fire status effect. Let's talk about something simpler now. The wet status effect is only applied to enemies that are fully or partly submerged in water. After leaving the body of water, the wet effect remains for exactly 7 seconds, indicated by water droplets. Some objects also gain a similar effect after being immersed in water, however it is purely cosmetic, and does not conduct the status effect. Wet enemies cannot be set on fire, even when covered in gasoline. Despite that, there seems to be a bug with Sisyphean insurrectionists and other huge enemies that causes them to still be flammable if covered in gasoline when in water. Additionally, enemies standing in water conduct electricity, though enemies out of water, still affected by the wet status effect, do not. There is a misconception about how street cleaners instantly die when wet. Street cleaners are perfectly fine with getting their feet in water. They only die when their gas tank is fully underwater, as their life becomes meaningless without fire. The next status effect is pretty much useless for the main game, but for this video to be complete, I would still like to describe it. Mad is an effect that can only be applied by the Crystal of Madness, a reference to Dusk. You can tell an enemy is mad by the green gas particles around it. Functionally, it is completely identical to enabling enemies ignore player and enemies attack each other cheats. The Madness effect never expires. If you toyed around in the sandbox, you probably noticed that certain groups of enemies do not attack each other, those being the Lesser Husks, Filth and Cancerous Rodent, Cerberus and Very Cancerous Rodent, Flesh Prisons, Drones and Flesh Prison Spawn, V2 and Big Johninator, and the Earth Mover defense system components. Note that even though the Flesh Prisons do not target each other, they do target the spawn dice, even their own. Some enemies are immune to madness, wholly or partially. The corpse of King Minos and its hand aren't affected by the crystal, but are by the cheats. King Minos is also not attacked by the Lesser Husks. The Cancerous Rodent and the Phase 1 Minotaur are affected by the identical cheats, but do not receive the status effect from the crystal. Leviathan isn't affected by the crystal, but does attack and is attacked by enemies. Interestingly enough, they aim for the weak point specifically. The Earth Mover's brain is also not affected by the crystal. However, it works perfectly fine with the identical cheats. Something Wicked is not affected by anything. Most enemies do not attack it, and it seems some of them are trying to follow it for some reason. That's all for Madness. We've talked about the debuffs of the game. Let's talk about the buffs now. Sandified is an effect that removes all blood from the enemy, causing it to not heal the player upon receiving damage. The only source of the effect is the Stalker. Several enemies cannot be sandified by the Stalker, including Stalkers themselves and the Cancerous Rodent. Each enemy, however, can be sandified individually via the Alter Arm or the console using the buffs command. Nothing much to say here. Blessed is an effect placed on the enemies by idols. Idols can only bless one enemy at a time. Blessed enemies receive no damage from all sources, except insta-killing stage hazards. Street cleaners can still die from water, even when blessed. Idols cannot bless themselves and death catchers. Even when blessed through external means, they do not become invincible. Puppeted is a buff applied to enemies resurrected by death catchers and to enemies spawned by blood fuel trees. Puppets spawn puppeted, no matter what, and cannot be unpuppeted. That was a whole lot of puppeted in a single sentence. Puppeted enemies have a speed multiplier of 0.75 and take double damage from all sources. This is counted as a buff, as puppeted enemies grant no style or kills on death, effectively harming the player more. Death catchers cannot revive certain enemies, those being the set-piece bosses, Something Wicked, V2, Minotaurs, other death catchers, puppets, and specifically Earthmover rocket launchers. Much like Sandified, this restriction can be bypassed via the Alter Arm or the Buffs Force Puppets On command. Puppeted Virtues and Cerberite cannot enrage. Puppeted Providences do not spawn hook points on death. Puppeted and Sandified cannot be applied at the same time. Now let's move on to a more interesting and perhaps the most direct buff of all. Radiance. You know it, you hate it, it's what makes Anchor level so ass. But let's see how it really works. Radiance is a buff applied to the enemies spawned in Anchor levels, High Wave Cybergrind, enemies under the Force Radiance cheat, as well as those blessed by destroyed Radiant Idol, and puppets spawned by Radiant Death Catchers. Radiant enemies get their health, speed, and damage values multiplied by a specified amount, dependent on the level of their Radiance tier. All enemies spawned in the Anchor levels and Cybergrind have their Radiance tier set to 1, as this is the default Radiance tier. In the Cybergrind, Radiant enemies begin spawning starting from the 25th wave. To find out when a certain enemy can spawn Radiant, you need to take the minimum wave they spawn at, multiply it by 2, and add 25. For every additional enemy of the same type, if their spawn cost is less than 10, add 1 to their cost, and add that to the previous wave an enemy of that type could spawn Radiant. Otherwise, divide their cost by 2 and add 5. You probably didn't understand anything. So let me give you an example. A Schism can spawn starting from the second wave. 2 times 2 plus 25 is 29. So a single Radiant Schism can spawn on the 29th wave. Its spawn cost is 5, which is less than 10, so we add 1 to 5 and get 6. Then we add 6 to 29 and get 35. So, from the 35th wave, you could see 2 Radiant Schisms at once. The cost of Radiant enemies is equal to that of their normal cost tripled. So a Radiant Schism requires 15 points to spawn. Hideous masses cannot spawn Radiant in the Cybergrind. Additionally, it is worth noting that in Anchor levels and the Cybergrind, enemies do not get damage buffs from Radiance to keep them from doing absurd damage. All Radiant enemies have specific values set for their health, speed, and damage buffs, so I'm going to list the multipliers for every enemy now. Cue the montage. Now let's discuss what happens on other Radiance tiers, and how they are calculated. Radiance tiers can manually be set through the Alter arm, or by using buff's Radiance tier set command, which sets the global Radiance tier. It is worth noting that in case of conflicting Radiance tiers, the game will always prioritize the higher tier, and as the default Radiance tier is 1, without the use of the console, it is impossible to truly set an enemy's Radiance tier to 0.5, or any value lower than 1. To calculate the exact buffs, you need to take the specific buff multiplier and multiply it by x. If the Radiance tier is equal or less than 1, then x is equal to the Radiance tier. Otherwise, this formula is used. Again, I'll give an example. Let's take the Schism again. By default, its health multiplier is 2.5. If we set the Schism's Radiance tier to 3, then the Schism would have a health multiplier equal to 1.5 times 2.5. So it would have 3.75 times more health. Using the Alter arm, it is possible to set Radiance tier from 0.5 to 10 on 0.5 unit increments. However, using console commands, Radiance tiers can be set to both values above 10 or less than 0. Additionally, damage, health, and speed multipliers can be set to values lower than 1, which nerfs the enemy. Damage isn't affected by this, however speed isn't, and by setting an enemy's speed multiplier to 0, you will make the enemy immobile. Setting health multiplier to values lower than 1 will nerf the enemy, making it more susceptible to incoming damage. On the contrary, setting health multiplier to 0 will not kill the enemy, and instead make it take infinite damage, but as the game is unable to process this, the enemy becomes immortal instead. It is also worth noting that in case of damage buffs, deflected projectiles will also deal increased damage. As for melee parries, they can be perhaps even better at times, because they completely bypass an enemy's damage resistance. In case you didn't know, the Radiance health multiplier does not affect health directly. Instead, it reduces incoming damage. So instead of having twice as much health, a Radiant enemy with a health multiplier of 2 receives half the damage you deal to it. So for example, Radiance Field can still be one-shot by melee parrying, despite having 5 times more HP. And even if they had 50 times more HP, they would still die in one hit. This is pretty much it for Radiance. Rage is also listed as a status effect in the wiki, however I do not consider it to be such, as it is incredibly enemy specific and has no consistent rules. If I ever make an enemy specific video, I will touch on that subject there. So, until we meet again, take care.